This is the first of a two-part conversation that I had with Jessie Mannisto. Jessie is the founder and editor-in-chief of Third Factor magazine, which she started in 2018 to create more accessible and easy to understand content around the theory of positive disintegration. We talk about how she discovered this theory, and she found it a really useful tool in understanding the experiences of friends and peers that she had who were also writers and social justice activists. Jessie has worn a variety of professional hats, including being a leadership analyst for the CIA and a Google Policy Fellow, where she explored the ways that we process information differently online. Jessie also lived in Japan for 3 years, and she was the chapter lead for the Democratic Socialists of America. She is now self-employed as a writer and a private intelligence analyst. In our first conversation, Jessie and I discussed the theory of positive disintegration, what it is, and how we can use it to understand development, particularly in adolescence. We talk about the overexcitable and intense child and how the theory of positive disintegration can help us understand why a lot of these kids typically are misunderstood or fly under the radar, and also what it looks like when you have a highly achieving, gifted child. We talk about how to parent or support young, intense people with confidence and flexibility. And then in our second part of our conversation, we discuss Jessie's interest specifically in gender dysphoria, and we talk about a piece that she wrote for Third Factor magazine where she interviewed several trans people and detrans people, all natal females, and talked about how their experiences with intensity played a role in their dysphoria. We also think through concepts around authenticity and groupthink and how this can unfold for intense dysphoric youth. We talk a little bit about our own experiences as overexcitable young women and how the concept of gender identity can impact going through puberty and adolescence with that intensity in your life. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hi, Jessie. How are you?
I'm doing good. Hi, Sasha. I've been looking forward to chatting with you about this.
I know, me too. You know, we've had this conversation planned for quite some time, and you and I have both been kind of respectively preparing for this. So I'm hoping we can strike a good balance between, sharing information that we've been compiling and getting ready for, and also just talking and being able to organically go where our conversation leads us. So I'm really, really excited to talk with you today.
Me too. So where do we want to jump in?
Well, I mean, I don't want to ignore the context that we are recording this in the midst of coronavirus. So I guess I'll just check in with you. How has this been for you? How is quarantining going? Tell me a little bit about how you're doing.
Oh, well, I feel fortunate relative to everyone else because we are not in the financial pressure that a lot of people are feeling, and I'm getting stir crazy. I'm realizing how much, because I work at home, I'm self-employed and I run my magazine from here, and how much I knew before this that getting out and interacting with people was essential to me having something to say and not just like living on the internet. So now I'm living on the internet. That's my big complaint. But hey, no one I know has COVID, and we're fine financially, so I'm not going to complain.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I also operate from my home office most of the time. So my day-to-day life feels pretty similar as compared to people who are no longer going into the office and having to kind of transfer their work to home. So in that regards, it feels actually pretty normal at some level, but also, it feels a little bit like there's some, I don't know if survivor's guilt is the right term, but I feel a little bit weird knowing that my life actually feels pretty peaceful relatively, and other people are having, the worst nightmare of their life. So it's this really strange sense of knowing that there's normalcy in like pockets of the world, and then other people are really having an awful time. So that's a really unusual feeling. I guess that is life in general, but really during this global crisis, it feels that way.
Yeah, I relate so much to that. It's changing how we look at our lives in that respect, and making those of us who are not, at least at present, suffering, I hope feel a little more appreciative of what we have.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting too, because on one hand, I can relate to the feeling of isolation. Like for me, also working from home means that I really have to create opportunities to get out in the world and have like a three-dimensional experience. And yet I'm like Zoom calling with my family much more often and connecting with people this way that otherwise I might have gone weeks and weeks and weeks without connecting to. So it's interesting. I mean, I think there are some ways that people are adapting and trying to stay connected despite the social distancing.
Well, and if I may throw something in that I think is relevant to what we're going to be talking about, just like the experience of Zoom calling with people you normally interact with and how that changes the interaction when things get, when you move things online. And even if you've got voice and you see people's faces, it's different. You know, the medium changes so much of the dynamic.
For sure.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And as a therapist who works predominantly online, I recognize there are some serious drawbacks to just sitting in front of a camera and holding your body in one position and not having that in-person interaction, not being able to see how someone moves their body and carries themselves. I mean, there's so many things about our communication which gets lost in this format. Even though it's a great gift to have it, it also doesn't, could never substitute like in real life hanging out or spending time with people.
Yeah. And I see how much I'm a squirmer when I'm on these videos. Like, oh, psychomotor overexcitability. Let me sway back and forth. Like, no. Sit quietly. Don't move.
And then there's like a picture of yourself staring back at yourself, which in and of itself is a really bizarre experience. So there's a lot about this that there is a learning curve and it's kind of weird. But I'm still really glad to be here, Jessie, talking to you.
Hey, me too, Sasha.
2D face to face.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes a lot possible.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this wouldn't be possible in a different era. So I'm glad to be here. So let's start by maybe, can you, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction for you, but can you just explain a little bit more about who you are and how you got interested in the theory of positive disintegration?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I discovered the theory of positive disintegration back when I was having trouble getting my career launched, like almost a decade ago now. I was in grad school. I was out of grad school. I got into this cool federal hiring program, which sounded great. I was going to have this cool federal job, but this was 2011, and that was when there was a budget crisis and Congress was like, no, don't hire anyone. And I'm like, okay, my life is like derailing. What am I going to do with myself? And I ended up working, instead of for our government, for the Japanese government in my hometown of Detroit. I'm in DC now, but I'm from Detroit. I lived most of my life there. And so I worked for the consulate of Japan in Detroit, and it was a pretty minor, like it was an assistant to a diplomat there, which sounds cool. I know everyone's like, wow, that sounds cool, but it was really boring. It wasn't very intellectually engaging. Okay. And I kind of felt like, oh, this is my life. I'm really bored. And that was when I ended up Googling gifted adults, right? Because I was in the gifted program, and that makes you think like you're going to do some great big thing and it's going to be meaningful. And then you're like, this is life. And did that happen to other people? Because, you know, I had a lot of time at this job and I'm like Googling stuff.
Yeah.
And that was how I discovered the idea of overexcitability. And that comes from the theory of positive disintegration. So that's like, you know, came kind of out of nowhere, but me having my own little very minor, but still a disintegrative experience. And I really thought that this picture that I saw there described me a lot. I relate to all of these domains of this thing called overexcitability, which, you know, we can get into that. But basically the idea of intensity. And I thought, wow, oh my gosh, that's me. And I started reading more about it. Now, a caveat, I've come to, you know, this was a long time ago. I've since come to have a really complicated opinion on the theory of positive disintegration and its relationship with giftedness and the whole construct of giftedness. And if people are listening to this and recoiling at that word, like, trust me, I'm there with you. Yeah. It maybe has its uses, but it's got a lot of problems too. But anyway, it introduced me to positive disintegration, and that's how I came to find it.
Okay.
Now, shall I?
Nope.
As for the gender dysphoria thing, right? Like, how did I get to know that?
Yeah.
That came a few years later. I started blogging. I was an activist. I was in the Democratic Socialists of America, which people know now, but they didn't know when I joined it in 2013. And I was blogging about all of this stuff, and I was in my federal job at that time, and the federal government as an employer gives you lots of opportunities for other forms of positive disintegration, and being an activist gives you lots of opportunities to see positive disintegration in action. And so I started in my blog, personal blog, I talked about this, and somebody asked me, who was also like, he was like off the scale IQ score, and also a left activist, and so he liked my blog, and he said, hey, what's your opinion about the transgender issue? And I, like so many people who come to this issue, are like, of course I'm for trans people, like what are you even asking about? And he's like, maybe you should read about the actual thing that's going on. I'd like to know your opinion. And yeah, like, I think it's the same story that everyone you talk to tells, or a lot of people who you talk to tell. But basically I thought, yeah, this is more complicated. And it really, I could see why someone was asking me about this when I blog about positive disintegration, because what struck me above all is that these young people, young girls and sometimes boys who are going through this are experiencing positive disintegration, because Kazimierz Dąbrowski, who came up with the theory, described puberty as a time when people would have positive disintegrations. And the person who told me about this was a reliable messenger who had my trust, and I started looking into it, and I started seeing a lot of kids who were honestly a lot like me. I had a hard time in puberty and adolescence and all that stuff, struggling with body changing and the compulsory femininity, which I didn't relate to. And those are things that even before the transgender question came up, would often come up in stories of like gifted women, intellectual women. And so I just thought, like, this is a place that positive disintegration should be talked about.
I think that's great. And I guess this would be a good time to actually define. So what is this? Because we hear these two words which seem to be juxtaposed, positive and disintegration. So maybe for people who are watching who have no idea what this is, can you explain what is this theory of positive disintegration? Then maybe we can loop in how the overexcitabilities play a role.
Sure. Yeah. I remember, so funny, like yes, people hear that and they're like, what does that mean? I went to the convention, the Congress for the Dąbrowski community in 2016, and it was in Canada, in Banff, near Banff National Park. So I went there and I started chatting with someone from, a different country about why I was there. And I said, oh, it's for this thing called positive disintegration. And they just like recoiled, like, that sounds horrible. Like, what would that mean? So basically, that gets at the heart of why this is an interesting idea, because it is the idea that you may go through a mental health crisis, but that this is part of your trajectory towards mental health. It's not taking you away from it. It's the path you must go through. I think it's kind of like the hero's journey put into a psychological theory. And you have to go through that dark night of the soul. Now, the theory of positive disintegration is this process of disintegrating and reintegrating. It's positive if you reintegrate at a higher level. And it's common to people who live with this higher degree of sensitivity and emotional intensity, because Dąbrowski was particularly attracted to artists and musicians and writers. He came up with it after a good friend of his who was a musician committed suicide, and he wanted to understand why. And I think, if I remember correctly, Dąbrowski was also going to be a musician and go to conservatory, and this just derailed his life plan, and he instead became a psychiatrist. So the idea that this very sensitive, intense cohort will only achieve mental health through this process of disintegration and reintegration, or is likely to need to go through it. Dąbrowski came up with 5, first of all, a couple constructs, right, that people will see first when they dive into the theory. The 5 levels that he came up with to describe this process, right? Level 1 through level 5, and we can talk about what's in those levels. And then there's what he called overexcitability, which are 5 domains, 5 levels, 5 domains that are channels for this inner intensity. They are intellectual, emotional, imaginational, sensual or sensory, and psychomotor, moving around a lot. So one thing that I should mention is that in a strict understanding of this theory, as Dabrowski laid it out, and he died in 1980, so we've learned a lot since then. There's this thing that he called developmental potential. And most people have at least some developmental potential, but according to Dabrowski, not many people have a lot of it. And you need to have a sufficient amount, whatever that sufficient amount may be, to experience this process of positive disintegration. And the things that Dabrowski said went into developmental potential, there were three things. One was special abilities and talents, which includes a high IQ, but some other things too, artistic talent, even athletic ability could do it, something that's pushing you to try to excel. The overexcitability, which is an innate physiological trait that's really similar to Elaine Aron's HSP, highly sensitive person. There's some differences there, but for now, you can think of them as the same as we get started. And then this thing called the third factor, and that's my magazine's title, right? Third factor. And that is this thing he called the autonomous factor of development. The first factor is nature, and the second factor is nurture, right? Your genetic endowment and your socialization, peer pressure, that kind of stuff. And this third factor was what Dabrowski said was your autonomous choice. It obviously rises out of the first two factors, but the idea that you have some sort of choice in who you become, and you make choices that guide your development. So Dabrowski emphasized how rare developmental potential was. And this is where, shall I jump in? You and I have sort of talked about this elitism of the theory, and which is sort of off-putting. So I can throw in my caveat here.
I bring up stuff for me too, so go ahead.
Dabrowski said that developmental potential is really rare, and he was using this to describe the sort of people who would risk their lives to save Jewish people from Nazis, which obviously not everyone did. He lived through 2 world wars. So there's a reason to say these are outstanding people in a certain way. But nowadays, when people are talking about Dabrowski's theory, you do get a lot of people who really kind of just want to use it to bolster themselves because maybe they've been wounded, whatever. And I just, I don't love that. I don't want to encourage that. We run into that at Third Factor magazine. But even if you put that aside, if you can step away from the idea that this is a sort of superior thing, I have developmental potential and other people don't. I like to look at it, and there have been some researchers who have sort of found reasons to recast it this way, as just a different developmental track. You can develop to become the best version of yourself in a lot of different ways. And the people who have the specific factors that Dabrowski put into his developmental potential, it's just a different track. And it's for those intense, artistic, unconventional people. So if you just look at it as the way that those people tend to, the path those people tend to follow, and then it grows out of the challenges that they face because they're overexcitable and because they're not adhering to the what's expected of them. You don't have to say that makes them better than other people. It's just different. Yeah.
I think as we talk and dig into some of the book, Living with Intensity, which I read in preparation for our call, this is going to become clearer to everybody who's watching. But I think there's a couple things that come up for me as I think through this. First of all, we all have a self-serving bias. And so whenever we read any theory of personality or development, there's a tendency for us to inject ourselves in it. And I think that's adaptive, obviously. We are a conscious being that is always trying to understand more about ourselves. We're curious about our behavior. I mean, particularly in the West, that is very much built into the way we are meant to grow and develop and understand ourselves. So, I mean, even if we took the elitism piece out, because I have noticed a lot of the writings, of course, are about these very unusual and exceptional people. But I think if we were to titrate down, there are so many elements of this theory that are applicable to people of all different kinds of jobs or interests. And what I notice is this desire to transcend the forces of socialization, or biology to live in a way that is really authentic for you and meaningful for you. And if we look at that piece of it, I think everyone can see some of themselves in this theory. And I think that's what's really cool about it. And of course, you take that at different levels. And of course, some people are able to achieve just an unbelievable amount of this positive disintegration and development. But I think there's application there for anyone, because we all have intensity to some degree. There are some people, of course, that you meet that it's really obvious that their intensity is far above the average. And as a therapist, I definitely see that. And I, as a therapist who's kind of explored this idea, I still try to utilize little chunks of it, even in kids who are kind of, average intensity or average intelligence, because everybody has a little bit of a drive to transcend just the humdrum of life, or what's expected of them in school. So I really like the theory when looking at it from that angle, because it applies on lots of different levels.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I really like the way you put that. And you did it so well. And I've been, because I've been working with trying to get this magazine to people, and how do I get it to those other people? Because they're like, well, I wasn't in a gifted program.
Yeah.
Or like, this makes me feel like I'm not living up, like I'm not as like, no, it's for you too. Like it shouldn't be exclusionary. At least I see value in it in that way. And I don't always like how other people have used it. So yeah, I'm on the record there.
It's kind of ideal. It's an idealistic kind of perspective that we can all just find this exceptionality within us. And I think obviously by definition, someone's going to have to be average, at least 75%, right? But I also have noticed, this is another kind of tendency that I'm seeing culturally, is that the theory of positive disintegration and giftedness can end up looking like an identity. Just like with so many other aspects of ourselves, we have gotten into this mode of like shuffling ourselves off into these identity categories. And so I'm assuming that your readers or anybody who's watching this just has to keep that in mind as well, because we don't want any particular set of traits to become like rubber stamped as an identity that separates us dramatically from others, even though it's useful in understanding, like, why do I have these weird things about me? We don't want to separate people out based on the gifted and the non-gifted. Like that's kind of a risky place.
For sure. That's actually a theme we're diving into in our upcoming, as we speak, the next issue is going to be May, June 2020. And we have 3 articles saying like, hey guys, like maybe stop making this your identity. I interviewed, are you familiar with Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman?
No,
he's got this new book out, Transcend, and he wrote something else called Wired to Create and something else called Ungifted. He deals with like the twice exceptional population, which is gifted with learning disability. And then I talked to him about his new book, and he's also really overexcitable. He even joked about that when I was talking, and we're like going like, oh my God, these people make it their identity. And it's like, come on, no, it's, the piece I'm working on about that is it's a life preserver. It's a very level 3 word. If I can come back to the levels, right? Level 3 is where you really need, like as a therapist, I think you're going to deal with a lot of people who are at level 3, where they see that there's a way up and maybe they don't think they can follow that way up. So they want to tell themselves like, yes, I'm gifted, kind of like doing the power pose, right? And maybe you need that at a certain stage, but don't make it your identity, right?
Yeah. Totally. I look at a lot of things from the developmental perspective. Like maybe this is a stepping stone on the way to being able to free yourself from thinking in this way, right? Like there are different kind of stages we maybe have to pass through in order to integrate that understanding of ourselves. And, I can relate to some of these traits, right? But I, of course, grew up at a time where I'd never even heard of such a thing. So for me, in ways that I was overexcitable, I just had to deal with it experientially, and learn like, okay, not everyone is going to care about talking about this for 5 hours like you, Sasha. So just tone it down. And I didn't have any language around it, but I just learned with time how to kind of rein in certain things and where to test the waters with, my enthusiasm for certain things. So it's interesting having like the kind of description of it in this theory versus just experiencing it without that. And I'm just really interested in how having this knowledge can impact people in a really positive way, I'm sure, especially if somebody is in a piece of their disintegration where they're really depressed or they're feeling highly anxious. This explanation and definition can probably be like this grounding force to say, I'm not just losing my mind. There's a reason I'm having this intense experience. So we can talk more about it. I guess I'd like to hear a little bit, Jessie, about which we're touching on, I think, like the orthodox version of theory of positive disintegration, and the way, like yourself and your magazine, like how people are kind of updating it and trying to understand it. We touched on it a little.
Yeah, we did a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of research being done that I talk in, and when I talk to Scott Bray Kaufman, he's really familiar with the theory. He mentions it in each one of those books I mentioned briefly. And he was pushing for understanding overexcitability as, so it's related to the 5 factors, openness to experience, that construct in modern language. That's what they would probably call it. And all the different domains in that are really related to what Dabrowski was looking at. But also just the idea that, studying these different levels as different experiences, kind of like what I was saying, like I found someone who agreed with me. So of course I'm like, yes, he's right. That's what I was already thinking. But the idea that these are different common developmental trajectories, which is really cool. People want to find belonging. And so they do find these groups, like, oh, maybe I'm ADHD or I'm autistic or something. And like, maybe that's being watered down, whatever. I won't go into that. That's another thing that people at Third Factor like to talk about. Why am I weird? But what's common to creative people, creative writers and creative artists have always been like, what's wrong with them? This is the thing people have studied for a long time. Yeah. And so, just moving the question of orthodoxy, what did Dabrowski actually say versus what we know nowadays? Michael Pukowski is an important name to look at in this area. He was the one who, I believe in like the 70s, early 80s, maybe like 1979 roughly, he introduced overexcitability as a way of trying to, or proposed it for testing as a way that we could identify people who were gifted. And like, what does gifted even mean? That's a huge can of words to open up. Even within gifted education, people don't agree. There's schools of thought. But they tried this and they considered this as a way to identify them. And that has mostly been put aside. It's still seen as a relevant thing to present to parents in gifted and talented programs, part of the socio-emotional landscape of giftedness. But I mean, in working with Third Factor readers and then talking to other people I know, my husband was in a science magnet, and he's got all these friends from high school he's still in touch with because he was in this magnet of people who are like him. Yeah. And some of them like don't experience overexcitability at all, but because maybe one hypothesis is that they just felt so supported early on. They felt a way to have those intense conversations, be validated and seen and heard. And others just, they didn't have that at a formative age, and they just didn't have a place to get their intensity channeled. And so that's, I think, where a lot of people are looking at right now. I would love to see this theory picked up by researchers. I'm a writer, I don't have a backing behind me to do these studies, but it just points to so much interesting research. I think about maybe I should go back to school and do this research myself because it seems so relevant, so fruitful. But yeah, so that's the state of things right now.
Okay. So then we touched on how this theory understands like an intellectual crisis or an emotional crisis or an existential crisis very differently from the way mainstream psychiatry and psychology might. Now, granted, there are a lot of theorists and therapists and psychiatrists who have alluded to these things before. I mean, I think Carl Jung talks about this in some ways as well. But I want to talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to probably read some little excerpts from the book, Living with Intensity. So this is actually by Susan Daniels and Pukowski, who if I pronounce that right, Pukowski. Yeah. So I want to read something, and then maybe we can just kind of talk about it together and see what comes up for us. So in this quote, there's a young man who's 17 years old, and he's gone through a breakup. And so there's like this little excerpt of his diary, and then they go on to explain how there's this element of a quest or a journey that is really exemplified in this passage. So this guy writes, "Yes, it's true. I've been in a state of extreme disintegration, very much so. I am not sure I can even describe it to you. Apart, dispassionate, disconnected, unfeeling. The girl I was once connected to has moved on. I've dropped out of university. It simply was not working. I hope that she has found a good guy. I hope to meet him one day. It will be easier if he is a good guy. I wish her the best, truly, but in truth, I can tell you I feel liberated in some way, as if something has lifted. I'm not sure we had a lot in common. I'm not sure the relationship had a lot of depth. I'm anticipating another disintegrative experience. It seems inevitable. I'm pretty sure I'll be okay, but I think I will disintegrate again. But a more resolute, integrative state is achieved. I'm feeling much better now, much better, but I definitely need something to do. Can you help me with that?" So it's like in this little passage, you see this man go from like absolute despair to like thinking about his girlfriend's needs and feeling like he's been freed from something, but knowing that another crisis is coming. And if we took a really like kind of traditional DSM look at that out of context, we might say, oh, this man is about to have a psychic break and maybe he's schizophrenic, or maybe, I mean, there are so many kind of less generous ways we could interpret that if we look at it from a more traditional kind of DSM framework. But I just love that they go on to say, you know, Ilya's heartfelt question is an entreaty to show that humility and a felt sense of a journey or process, which is ultimately for him a quest. Yeah. So this is about that integrating up at the next level. Like, what comes to your mind when I read that or when you think about that?
Yeah, that's such a great passage. I'm glad you picked it out because it shows so much of what's going on with these intense people. You see the intellect battling with the emotions and the trying, you know, feeling your feelings, whether they're higher or lower, you know, but he's really trying very hard to choose to follow the direction of the higher emotions and having humility and having generosity to someone who's probably hurt him and maybe didn't always behave in a way that was commendable. You can imagine how breakups work. Yeah. And yet, and you see in that the swirl of lots of thoughts and lots of feelings. And you're right, like people turn to this, if they go for help and people are not familiar with this level of intensity, it's like, okay, well, let's get out the DSM-5 and see what can stick. Yeah. But if you understand that this is a thing that a lot of very intense people experience, and you see that there is a way out and that this can be constructive, the idea that there can be such a thing as a positive disintegration, just even knowing that is useful knowledge to someone going through it. And it shows you how this is like, it's a quest. It's the hero's journey, and it's, you know, you wanna rise to the challenge and see, because we all want to be, we're the heroes of our own stories, and so it gives some framework to that rather than like, oh, I'm defective, something's wrong with me because I am depressed and I'm feeling these things and I'm overthinking, you know. That's what I think. What this framework can do there.
Yeah. It's interesting because as a therapist, when I'm working with somebody who has been through a really difficult thing, even though breakups are ubiquitous, it doesn't mean they don't have a very strong emotional impact on us. And oftentimes I find myself trying to help a client access this intense experience of emotion that sometimes we cover up with just these rationalized explanations like, oh, he was a jerk, or I am not good enough. And it's like, even though this young man experienced this intensity on his own and organically, I feel like in order to have a process of healing and growth, everybody should try and tap into the intensity that they feel. And you said, you know, he's feeling all his feelings.
Yeah.
And what we know is that emotions are not uniquely possessed by the gifted or overexcitable. We all have them. Of course, some people are certainly less emotionally intense than others. But I see that as part of the therapeutic process to help someone access all these different layers of sometimes conflicting emotions or emotions that can all be jumbled up together in response to an experience. Really cool to see how this is being given a legitimate, like, psychological explanation.
For sure. The one thing that stands out if you are emotionally intense is that you might have learned that people are extra afraid of your feelings.
Yes.
But even that, I'm like, anybody could have learned that their feelings set off a negative response in someone. So I don't know if even that is a special thing to this crowd, but they probably will relate to, like, oh, I have to be rational. A columnist for Third Factor wrote about how she thought being rational would keep her safe. She's very bright. And so she wanted to be like Spock, Spock and Data. She wrote about. She loved that in Star Trek. And she realized that it wouldn't. And that process of realizing that her feelings were actually meaningful guides.
Yes.
Because if people are intellectually inclined, regardless of IQ or gifted status, if you have that sort of like cerebral inclination, you might devalue your own emotions and not listen to them.
That's right. And it's interesting because there is a lot of talk of numbness. I mean, I think at some point in our conversation, I addressed that, but feeling numb, I think is a consequence of continually trying to hyper-rationalize and discounting the importance and value of the emotional experiences. And you do lift up, and I think we are going to talk about this later, but how being really sensitive to those around you and how they respond to your emotions can exacerbate this kind of sensitivity cycle, right? So we'll get into that some more.
Yeah.
So I wanted to also just read another chunk here about neuroses. So it says, positive disintegration of an individual's self-conceptualization is the idea from Jabrowski's work that recognizes psychoneuroses, anxiety, and depression as an appropriate, natural, and necessary breakthrough for persons in accelerated development. This can occur when an individual moves from the influences of genetic endowment and cultured conditioning, determined by both biology and culture environment, to an advanced development towards a personality ideal. So again, just this framing of anxiety and depression as possibly part of a move towards some kind of personality ideal. And, I know in psychology, there's a lot of talk about the current crisis that we have of anxiety, and of course it also is scary because it comes along with higher rates of suicide and things like that. And I wonder too if the way we treat it and the way we understand it doesn't really create room for that opportunity, for that further development if a kid is highly anxious or is dealing with depression. So I don't know, what comes to your mind for that?
Yeah. That's the power of this theory and the idea of this being a developmental track, that certain people will have these psychoneuroses, to use the term of Dabrowski's time. And that, when they talk about accelerated development, they're talking about that track of people who are nonconformists, more unusual, don't fit the mold, the square peg in the round hole. And that's a thing that's going to cause anxiety and depression without being like, gee, you have anxiety, that's a thing we need to treat. Yeah. It's just an arbitrary defect out of the blue. No, this is expected. This is part of the path you're following. Yeah. And it's because all the guidance that society puts out there about how you should be, I'm not going to criticize that. Like, maybe there's good and there's pros and cons to that, but society says be this way, and you're not that way. You can't fit that mold. Mm-hmm. You're going to feel anxious and depressed, but then what do you do with that? Mm-hmm. Like, maybe that's a signal. Again, listen to your emotions. Why do I feel that way?
Yeah. I'm thinking too about the role of social media, and when we say society tells us this or that, we're really talking about multiple different little societies too, because if you're a 15-year-old kid, your world is even more relegated to these like online social spaces. And, you know, a lot of kids kind of go with the flow and they function okay in that kind of online space where you're Snapchatting yourself and all these filters and they're just, you know, participating. But for many of the kids that I work with, that does not feel right for them. And they're not sure why. You know, they don't know why this feels so distressing. And having that framework of, you know, maybe you feel uncomfortable with this because it's not right for you, or there's something about these interactions that don't feel very good. It's important to be able to kind of trust your intuition or trust your own senses. And I think it's very disorienting when kids don't really know how to do that. And they don't know where their kind of grounding force is of like, if something I see makes me uncomfortable, why is that? Is it because there's something wrong with me or something wrong with what I'm looking at? And it's just a disorienting process when you throw in social media into the mix, because there's now multiple layers of reality.
Yeah, so true. And with the likes and the feedback and why isn't anyone sharing my stuff, like I'm so glad that wasn't around when I was a teenager. And that the, you know, external validation, it's important. I'm not going to say like it doesn't matter what anyone thinks of you. Like it does matter, but it doesn't have to be the answer to your life. Like how you also need to push back, and that's such a sophisticated thing. You can say like, yeah, sometimes you should go with the flow, and sometimes you should push back. Like, well, when? You know, that's like what adolescents have to learn, and it's really hard. And if you want to push back more than others or in ways that no one else is pushing back, like that's very difficult. So, it does take a level of sophistication and maturity, especially because teenage brains are primed to really place a high value on what their peers think. So it's very difficult to be in that position and to be sorting through all of these things when your brain just doesn't really set you up for that highly kind of like individual stance. It's really priming you to care way too much what others think. And obviously for lots of these kids, they're not going to be able to just go with the flow, and maybe they're not supposed to just go with the flow. Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, this kind of brings us to the next question, which is kids are often, or gifted kids are often misunderstood. So this is another misconception maybe we can talk about. You know, when we use the word gifted, the assumption is that's a highly achieving kid who never has emotional problems and they're just, you know, perfect on every level. And that's not necessarily the case. So let's talk a little bit about that. And then I want to discuss when a gifted kid does kind of align with our expectations. So tell me what happens when a kid has these overexcitabilities, but they don't really fit the mold of what we expect to find in like a gifted child. Oh yeah, for sure. So this kid, you know, I talked about the controversy even in gifted education, and there are some people who would say like, well, they ain't gifted then, you know, like they're not achieving. Giftedness is achievement. But if you really look at what, you know, IQ is measuring, the intellectual activity, those are separate things. IQ and intellectual engagement, even those can be teased apart. But for our purposes here today, let's ignore that. Yeah. The really intellectually engaged person is not necessarily going to feel like this achievement. They're going to question the purpose of this achievement. They're going to say like, this is easy for me. There's no point to it. Like, sorry, I'm peacing out. Like, this is not worth my time. They're going to maybe be rejected by their peers for being this kind of intellectual person, for asking annoying questions, you know, for being a gadfly and a troublemaker, all sorts of things. And they can just say, like, screw it, I'm done. I'm not going to be involved in this. And that's actually really common once you start talking to people with children identified as gifted. I'm not a parent, but I've now encountered a lot of people saying this, you know, like my husband who went to a magnet program, and yet his dad joked that he graduated from college summa cum laude. It's like, this is not, I don't care about these subjects. And he did better. It was useful for him in his life because he thought he should be a computer scientist. That's what he thought he should do. But he was failing his computer science because he couldn't make himself do it. But he was excelling in his Chinese class. And so he became a Chinese language scholar. Whoa. And then people are impressed with that. But then like actually like being a language scholar doesn't really get you a job. So that's a digression. But life is not necessarily easy for the person with a very strong, with intellectual overexcitability, someone who is pursuing that activity in their brain. It doesn't always lead you to an easy place. In fact, it usually leads you away from the easy place.
Yeah. I also think about how for some kids, the entire model of education or going to university and picking a major and taking these classes, it doesn't really feel that intellectually stimulating, you know? And if you are really craving this intense experience of pursuing things that spark your interest or really get you enthusiastic, the idea of sitting in a classroom and hearing, I mean, some college classes, of course, are highly stimulating, but a lot are not. And they're just kind of rote reproduction of these kind of boring themes. And oftentimes even the professors aren't that into it. So there are a lot of kids who do have this highly stimulatable imagination and intellect, but they don't really feel like school is their jam. And that's why I think in the book they talk about how important it is to find the right programs for kids who are like that, because a typical, you know, education may not be able to satisfy those needs. And then if they aren't achieving on paper, they just kind of look like an average kid, but really there may be other reasons behind that. So that's really interesting to me.
Or there's the model, in addition to that, it made me think of the one who's, you know, the kid who's really bright and can see all the possible problems with, you know, the lesson is presented to them and they see all the problems with it, but they know what the right answer is and they give the right answer. And if you bring up the fact that, like, hey, there's some complexity here, it might make them really uncomfortable because they know it and they see it, but they also know that no good will come of bringing it up, or at least it'll be difficult. It'll stir up problems for them. And so those kids can end up feeling like really boxed in and stressed later on, because you think eventually one day your insights might have a place, but you never get to the place where people really want to hear you talk back to the professor or your boss, you know?
Yeah.
You don't learn how to do that.
That's another weird way that the internet and reading too many definitions of things messes people up, because it makes us, so the other day I was talking with a kid about skateboarding, and this kid had been watching all these YouTubers do these tricks. And you're watching people who have mastered the tricks. And they make it look easy. And the same is true. I mean, I have a background in dance. And so when you watch like a really skilled dancer, the execution looks effortless. It looks intuitive. And that's what it takes to make something look beautiful, whether it's an art form or whatever. And we forget that behind that clip, there's just hours and hours and hours of botched, failed tricks or drills or falls or, you know, all these things that we don't see. And there's an illusion that happens when we have access to the best of the best. Like, I think that's a gift of the internet, right? You can look up like, what's the best recipe for chocolate chip cookies ever? And you could just zero in on it without having to make like 100 batches of awful cookies. So I don't know. I mean, it's just really interesting thing that happens. If you are a perfectionistic person, I feel like the internet's trying to make us all be too perfectionistic, but you don't see just all the failure or the experience that leads somebody to have those soft skills, to develop them. And it does take development. It doesn't just exist.
Yep. You can't just go off and start your Instagram feed of your perfect things. Like,
no,
you saw another one that you liked. Yeah.
We could go off in so many directions, but this is good. So the next point that was on our list is just, what are some general parenting strategies that you can point to if you do have a really intense child with these overexcitabilities who might be in some kind of process of the disintegration part of positive disintegration? What advice can you give parents?
Yeah. So I whenever I talk about this, I like to caveat it with, like, I'm not a parent. I'm giving this advice as a former child who was like this. You know?
Okay.
And I have talked to parents, you know, who are experiencing this. And so, I mean, one thing you can do, which you're already doing if you're watching this video, is familiarize yourself with these concepts of overexcitability and positive disintegration. you might recognize it in yourself, like understand it in yourself too. And think about the dynamic that it's creating, you know. Joining groups. There are a lot of groups online where you can talk about this, like maybe, because I know people come to you talking about gender dysphoria, but if you want to talk about something else around that, you know, talk about these parenting of gifted, and maybe your viewers are already in some of those. And so it's important to note there that the ethics of those groups, the values of those groups are going to be different. And some of them are probably going to, you know, be mad about the gender dysphoria, like you have to affirm that's a thing that's going on, I know. And so just keeping that in mind, you know, being aware that a lot of these people may have this emotional intensity as part of what brought them to this group. And when you're with other people who are all emotionally intense, whether it's within a family or whether it's a friend group, like your child could be suffering because they're drawn to other emotionally intense people, and that just causes, you know, the fireworks to fly.
Oh yeah. And
so just understanding this has been really useful, at least to the people who read Third Factor magazine.
Yeah.
And the other thing I think I would throw out is mentorship. Like I sort of alluded to that earlier. There's somewhere in Living with Intensity, near one of the passages that you read, that talk about, you know, these kids are in age homogenous groups, and that's you know, and then they go online and maybe they're in that, or maybe there's people from different ages in there. I'm not going to open that can of worms, but getting exposed to people who are not just their age peers can also be really useful. The idea that gifted kids are sometimes this thing called asynchronous, and they need to interact with people at all different levels of development. And so maybe they can mentor young kids rather than having mentors themselves. They can be the mentor, or maybe they can, you know, find some people, older kids or even adults, who really care about what they care about. So those are some things I've heard people mention as potentially helpful, for what it's worth, from someone who's not a parent, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I also was thinking about something I hear from parents. Some of this I think has to do with the way a lot of gender dysphoric kids are very well versed in certain types of language, certain definitions, certain gender terms, and that can be really bewildering to a parent that does not know what their child's talking about. But I also think parents with very, very intelligent children who are really good at debate, they feel like, sometimes I hear parents say, my kid is just way smarter than I am. I don't know how to discuss things with my child. And it made me really kind of highlight this one passage from the book that says, this is advice for parenting, and they're talking about parenting style, communication, and discipline. And one parent says, remember that we are in the parental driver's seat, that even if they could produce a better argument than I can, I still pay the big bucks to make the final call. Because I'm the parent. I can say, you know, it just doesn't feel right to me, or I don't have the energy for that right now. And things like that can be a good enough reason for setting a limit. It's important not to give up your parental authority just because they can out-argue you. Also, family sharing of choices for read-alouds, field trips, etc., make a really big difference in cooperation. Yeah. So this is really nice because I don't think parents should parent purely from an authoritarian kind of I told you so perspective, but parents do need to have a sense of confidence in the fact that they are making loving decisions on behalf of their children. Yes. And parenting a highly gifted child, I imagine, is this constant ebb and flow between making space for the child and their intensity, and then also kind of holding your own ground as a parent, because you are, no matter what, you are more mature than they are. You know, we're going to talk later about this disparity between intellectual ability and emotional maturity, but you are the person in the driver's seat. And even if you don't make perfect parenting choices all the time, you are the person they look to for guidance. So I think that's really important.
That is such an important point, because so that brought to mind when you said that, someone who is an active reader of Third Factor and chats with me sometimes, who is now, I believe he's in his 60s, and he is profoundly gifted. He was reading, at age 6, he was reading the Stoics because he wanted to understand why he was different. Like this was a bright kid.
Yeah.
And he has chatted with me about the fact that if you're what they call profoundly gifted, if you have that high an IQ, you can win a debate and be totally wrong. Like you just are good at debating. It doesn't mean you're right.
Yeah.
And he said that as the profoundly gifted person. And yeah, I think that we need to remember that intellect isn't the same as wisdom, and that parents, you get wisdom from living. Yeah. And parents should not doubt that they're the ones who are likely to have the wisdom in this case. Like, yeah, sure, listen to your kid, but you don't doubt yourself. Like, absolutely.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I end up finding that is what I go to over and over when consulting with families. Like, trust your parental instincts, trust your wisdom, trust what your gut is telling you about the situation. Now, of course, there are times when people feel so disoriented by a parenting situation that they don't really even know what they feel. But often we're really just kind of helping parents to just slow down and trust what their wisdom is telling them to do. So I appreciate that. And maybe we can also throw into the notes some resources. Like, I know Paula Prober is an author who talks about parenting gifted kids. And if there's anything else you can include, we can throw it in.
Yeah, no, Paula is great. She came up with the idea of the rainforest mind, which is what describe maybe this cohort of gifted without using the G word, and specifically this cohort of the intense, complex ones. Yeah. There's also a therapist named Amy Lowe who wrote about emotional sensitivity and intensity. She's got a book that's good on that, especially for the emotional overexcitability. And yeah, so those are two who have put out books that I think might be relevant to this crowd.
For kids who are emotionally overexcitable, I think that can often really challenge parents because, again, we tend to look at that as maybe an indicator of a mental health problem or something like that. So can you maybe share any experiences that you have had as a kid that you think were grounding if you had like really big emotions? Like, what should parents be thinking about? Yeah, geez, that's a hard one because in a lot of cases, I just had to get through it. And I intimidated my parents a lot. Like, I'm not going to lie. Now, so what I can say is, like, I seem to have turned out okay. So even though I was a difficult child to parent, because I had all 5 of the overexcitabilities. So yeah, I mean, I guess in that case, rather than come up with an example from my life, because I'm just sitting here going like, oh, I was a tough kid. But Amy Lowe's book, she goes into the possible mental health diagnoses and when you could be, like, when you really should consider, I mean, we interviewed her in a recent issue, hiding gifted or HSP in our last issue. And she talks about that, like, maybe you could benefit from mental health counseling, but maybe it's not a diagnosis. And maybe it's not diagnosable. And she has some insights into when that, like, if you're really harming things. Now, I'm not going to put words in her mouth now at this point, but she addressed that pretty effectively. Yeah. I mean, and then for me, I mean, I was the classic kid who, I went on the internet. I was a teenager in the late 1990s. And I just think that was the golden age of the internet. I know I would have probably been dragged into those, the Tumblr universe if it had been around then, and it wasn't. But instead, I found creative writing. I mean, I'm a creative writer. I'm working on a novel now. Like, that was, I think, now that I've talked through it a little bit, that was where I poured my emotions, and it was a way to process it and sort of take it and remove it from myself. Yeah. And it was interesting because I would put these stories on the internet. I had a website, I had a creative writing website, I had a following, which was pretty cool. It's like, now I do Third Factor. Like, this is a thing I've been doing since I was a teenager. And people would sometimes, like, question things my characters did. Like, they liked it, but they'd be like, well, why did they do that?
like I did not go to the prom. I'm going to put that out there because I was so disillusioned with high school. I'm like, get me out of this place. Like, I'm not going.
Mm-hmm.
And so my characters didn't go to the prom, and my readers were like, I wanted to see them go to the prom. Like, why didn't they do that? It seemed like a total non sequitur to them. And I was like, wow. Like, let me tell you my angry teenage reason that they didn't. Because, like, well, these characters were a set of septuplets, and they were famous. And I was like, well, they wouldn't go because the media would be there taking pictures of them. And they're like, screw that, I'm not going. But it was really my way of sort of putting out there the emotions that I didn't feel comfortable talking about.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that was for me in my teenagehood.
So, I mean, you had an outlet. So I'm kind of thinking about from the parenting side, is to find ways to give your kids outlets. And when it comes to the emotional overexcitability, one thing I find myself telling parents often is that big emotions are not necessarily a crisis.
Yes.
Your child is having a huge reaction. That means that you have to sit with that to some degree, right? As a parent or as any loving adult who's in the presence of a child kind of losing their shit, you have to just be with it. And it might be helpful to name it and to say it's okay to feel that way, and just give the kids some space to have it. And that's a little bit different from, we need to get you calm in the next 10 seconds or else we're leaving the store. You know, now granted, if you're in a store, you maybe can't make space for a child to have a complete meltdown, but we're talking about teens usually, right? I work with teens. So just making space for the kids' emotions and then to create opportunities where they can channel it. And this gets really tricky because I definitely advise parents to watch out for their child's internet use. But for some kids, the internet is providing this outlet. If they are writing fan fiction or doing YouTube videos or whatever, so it is important to find a way to still give kids those opportunities, especially these days, and especially during COVID. The internet is the way kids have an outlet. I mean, in my day, we were going outside, we were inventing stories about Native American burial ground in our next door neighbor's house. We actually played outside, but these days the playground is the computer. Yeah. And it can also be a very kind of dangerous place because you can have all kinds of very shady types of experiences on a computer while your parents think, oh, we're in suburbia, you're sitting in your room, it's fine. But we do have to be careful to be mindful of the way the internet and the way kids' playgrounds are serving these needs and an outlet for some of these excitabilities and their creativity.
Yeah, unfortunately, and even though I talk about the golden age of the internet and how I'm glad I was a teenager then and not now, even then, even then we saw things on the internet that was like, oh, for all the emotional outlet I'm having through my writing, now I have this thing that I was exposed to that is confusing to me and that I just, wouldn't have been exposed to in the real world until later. So yeah, it's definitely a double-edged sword. I have no insight on how to handle that.
We'll say good luck, parents.
Yeah. I'm sorry that you have to deal with that.
Yeah, it's hard.
It's hard.
Well, I imagine that this interview is probably going to be a two-part because we've been chatting for some time. You and I will keep going, but this might be a good place to kind of wrap up the first section of the interview where we kind of explained overexcitability. And in the second section, which we will be doing right now, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about overexcitability and gender dysphoria.